All right, well, welcome everyone to week one of the course. As I told you in the introduction video, every week I'll be putting up a relatively brief video overview of the topics and information that we're going to cover each week. And so this is your overview video for week one of public finance and budgeting. As you know from your syllabus, the primary reading for this week will be Mike Sell, Chapter 1, as well as two articles out of the Shafritz Classics text, the one by Woodrow Wilson that you're all as public administration students very familiar with, as it's kind of the article that started the discipline of public administration, and then also a more budgeting focused article by Willoughby. So that's going to be your reading for this week. So what we're going to talk about this week. First thing we'll talk about this week is what is a budget. You know, we usually think about budgets as being documents that tell us how much money we are spending and what we are spending that money on. I think that's a very fine, simple definition of a budget. But I think it's incumbent upon us as a budgeting course to really recognize the more profound definition of a budget. It goes beyond just telling us how much money we're spending and what we're spending that money on. Rather, a budget will also tell us the priorities of a society. Because when you think about a budget, you have unlimited demands and very limited resources. When infinite demands come into contact with finite resources, by definition, it means you're going to have to make some decisions. You're going to have to prioritize where those monies will be spent. Whenever you are prioritizing, some programs will make it into the public budget, some programs will be excluded from the public budget. And so when you look at a budget and you look at what we're spending our money on and how much money we are spending on all those different areas, a statement really does become, a budget really does become a statement of societal priorities. So it will tell us where our priorities are as a society. So if you think about that, that type of definition, we define a budget as a statement of societal priorities, we are elevating the importance, we're elevating the significance of a public budget beyond just being a statement of dollars and cents. So as we go throughout this entire course, I hope that you will think about a budget in that perspective of being a statement of societal priorities, which then again elevates its importance in the world of public administration. So if we accept this idea that a budget is a statement of societal priorities, the question then is what priorities get included in that budget and what priorities are excluded? Well, what gets included in a budget and what does not get included in the budget is oftentimes dependent upon how we define the expenditures. So the goods that we are producing and providing in that budget, are those goods considered public goods or are they considered private goods? If you categorize a good to be a pure public good, then you would not be surprised to see that good appear in that budget and that we would pay for that good in that budget. If, however, we define the good as a pure private good, then we wouldn't anticipate seeing it in the budget because that's something that can be produced and provided for by the private sector. So there are some goods that are clearly pure public goods, and there are some goods that are good examples of pure private goods. An example of a pure public good typically tends to be things like national defense. Well, why is national defense considered a pure public good? It's considered a pure public good because it is both non-excludable and non-exhaustive. We cannot exclude people from partaking in the benefits of national defense. You can't say, well, you get national defense, but your neighbor does not. Everyone gets the benefits from national defense. So it's non-excludable. It's also non-exhaustive. So if I have this horrible paranoia that we are going to be invaded by Canada every day, I'm probably going to get this great benefit out of having national defense. You may not share that same paranoia, so you may not get as much of a benefit out of national defense, but we cannot charge people based upon the benefits that they get. And me getting my benefit from national defense does not erode your ability to also gain a benefit from national defense. So national defense is non-excludable, it's non-chargeable, it's also non-exhaustive. Contrast that to a pure private good. So if there's a candy bar on the shelf in the convenience store, you and I both go in to get that candy bar. That good is excludable. If I walk in there and I don't have the dollar to pay for that candy bar, I don't get to consume that candy bar. I have been excluded from partaking in the benefits of the candy bar. So it is excludable. It's also exhaustive, because if there's one candy bar on the shelf, if we both have the money, we both go in there, one of us gets it, one does not. So my ability to get and consume that candy bar eliminates the possibility for you to get and consume that candy bar. So we become rivals for that good. That excludability, that exhaustibility, that rivalrous nature then makes that good what we consider to be a pure private good, and we then leave it to the private sector to produce and provide that pure private good. So those are two opposite examples, and those are easy ones because they're at the opposite ends of the spectrum. Pure public versus pure private. Where we really run into controversy is when we get into the gray area in between. And there's a huge gray area in that spectrum between a pure public and a pure private good. In that gray area, you have things like toll goods and common pool goods. A toll good is a good in which it is excludable, but it's non-exhaustive. It is excludable because if you go up to a toll bridge and you go up to a toll booth, if you pay the toll, the bar goes up, you get to drive on it. If you don't pay the toll, the bar stays down, you're excluded from driving on that bridge. So it is excludable. But it's technically non-exhaustive, because me driving on the bridge does not mean that you are not allowed to drive on the bridge as well. So that's what we call a toll good. A common pool good is the opposite of a toll good. So the common pool good, it's going to be non-excludable, but it will be exhaustive. So an example of that would be like mineral rights and mineral pools. It's non-excludable. Everyone should have a right to it, but once it's used up, it's gone. It's in limited supply. So pure public goods, we anticipate seeing in a public budget. Pure private goods, we anticipate not seeing in a public budget. Toll and common pool goods, it depends. It depends on how many elements of a private good they have, how many elements of a public good that they have. The more goods that you define as being a pure public good, the larger the scope of your public budget. The more goods you consider to be pure private goods, the smaller your public budget becomes. So this difference between public and private goods not only has implications for the size and the scope of our public budget, but has implications for who should be doing what in terms of the provision and or production of that good or service. And you've noticed probably along the way I've been saying provision and or production. Now, I've taken great pains to differentiate between the words provision and production. Well, why? I do that because there are differences between those terms. When we're talking about provision of a good, we are talking about giving the resources, making the resources available for the production of the good. The production of the good is the actual creation of the good. So if you think about it in terms of higher education, the provision of higher education will be the resources it takes to make a class like this happen. Those resources come from tuition dollars, etc. That's what provides for the education. The actual production of the education is what is going on now and what's going on within the class. That's a very important distinction, because for some goods we can have public provision and private sector production. For some goods, the public sector does both provision and production. For other goods, it does both private provision and private production for other types of goods. If it's a pure public good, you're probably going to have public provision and production. If it's a pure private good, you're going to have private sector provision and production. If you fall into that gray area with toll goods and common pool goods, that's where you can really get a mixture of which sector, public or private, is doing the provision and which sector is doing the production. When the private sector fails to provide and or produce a good that is determined essential by society, that's when we have this concept you're familiar with, I'm sure, called a market failure. So the market fails to provide or produce a good or service that is deemed essential by society, we've got a market failure. Again, market failure is not a pejorative term against the private sector. There are some good reasons why the private sector would fail to provide and or produce a good or a service. If it doesn't provide a profit, it doesn't contribute to that company's bottom line, that company probably is not going to engage in provision and or production. Sometimes there are logistical obstacles to the production of a good. You know, in the news today, we've had a lot about the U.S. Postal Service. But the U.S. Postal Service, one of the reasons why it's the only organization that engages in daily mail delivery is, number one, it is a constitutional organization when you read Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. But the services it provides in terms of daily mail delivery, those services are so expensive that it would be cost prohibitive for a private sector organization to say, well, we're going to start taking over daily mail delivery, even if they were allowed to constitutionally. So sometimes the obstacles to entering that market are just way too high to have a corporation enter into the market and engage in provision or production. So when the market fails, that then recommends to us a role for government. It would recommend to us another thing we're going to spend money on, another object of expenditure we're going to spend money on in our public budgets, thereby increasing the size and the scope of that public budget. Another reason why we may have government provision and or production of a good or service is the presence of externalities. And again, this is probably a term you're familiar with. Externalities are consequences. So if we are creating widgets, we've got this wonderful widget factory up on the hill, and we are doing our best to create the best quality widget we can create. But in the process of creating that widget, we pollute the river that runs behind the factory. That is a negative consequence. That's what we would call a negative externality. Absent altruistic motivations, there really aren't a whole lot of reasons for that corporation to clean up that pollution. You know, they may just want to be a good neighbor and a good citizen, but beyond that, there's really no economic imperative to get them to clean up that pollution. So it suggests for us a role for government to come in and mandate that pollution cleanup. So it's a role for government. So negative externalities like pollution recommend a heightened role for government in provision and or production, and especially in regulation. Well, even goods that create a positive externality, which is a good outcome for society, may also recommend a heightened role for government. So if you think about a childhood immunization program for low-income families, the direct beneficiaries of that program will be those eligible low-income families. But ostensibly, if you're providing those immunizations, then there's a spillover effect to society as a whole, in that people who don't fit within that target demographic, hopefully they will stay healthier because these children are being immunized. That's a positive externality. Those people who are staying healthy and enjoying that positive externality, in economics we call those free riders. Well, the problem is that whenever a corporation determines its supply and demand curve, and it determines how much of a good to create, it's going to determine that based upon demand. Well, it can easily measure the demand of consumers who are directly purchasing that good. But if there are other free riders who get a benefit from that good, but are not directly purchasing it, the corporation is not going to include those free riders in its definition of demand for the good. So demand, the definition of demand will be artificially lower than it really should be. Well, if your demand is lower, then you're going to produce less of that good. Your supply is going to be lower as well. So the private sector will probably produce less of that good than we would like for them to produce. So that then recommends to us a role for government to get involved to subsidize the production of that good. So even when we have positive externalities, there is a role suggested for government in the provision and or production of a good or service. So externalities, the presence of externalities, these unintended consequences, can also expand the size of our public budgets by suggesting a heightened role for government intervention. How do we limit the size of the public budget? Well, we often at times do it through privatization. As I'm sure you all know, we had a major movement to privatization in the 1980s and the 1990s, which was relatively successful at doing what we call load shedding, removing some of the load of work from government and shifting it to the private sector. The way in which it shifts it to the private sector is through contracting out. So the public sector will enter into a contract with a private sector organization to go out there and produce the good. In privatization, you have government provision because it's government that is paying for that contract, but you have private sector production because the actual creation of that product will be done by the private sector. So in this first week, we're kind of taking that public finance type of perspective, where we define what a budget is, we define the types of goods and services that you find within that budget, and we talk about some of the reasons why we can either see a public budget expand in scope or contract in scope, depending upon whether you're talking about market failures, externalities, or the presence of privatization. So this week just kind of gives us an idea about what public budgets are and the types of things, types of goods and services that we tend to see within those public budgets. So in addition to your reading in this video, there are a variety of other videos that are provided for you this week. One on the purpose of budgeting, one on the federal budgeting process itself. You got a couple on market failures. You have one on externalities, and then another one that divides up our goods into public versus private versus common pool versus toll. So just some of those videos to help reinforce some of the concepts we've talked about in this video, as well as some of the concepts from your reading. Also this week, you've got a sneak preview of your critical assignments. Again, this is not due this week. This isn't due until week 8, so you have a few weeks to work on this. But I think it's important that you get a sneak preview of what the critical assignment is going to look like, so you can kind of target some of your work in the class to helping you create that final product. Since this is a budgeting course, when you leave a course like this, at the very minimum, you should be able to know how to put a very simple budget together. So part 1 of your critical assignment will be the creation of a consolidated budget based upon an exercise that I am providing to you. And we'll go through that exercise in just a second. So part 1 of your critical assignment will be creating a simple line item budget. Then in part 2 of your critical assignment, you will provide for me a justification for why you did what you did in creating that budget. As you'll see when we look at the assignment itself, in creating this budget, you will need to do some budget reductions. You're going to have to make some cuts in order to get to the target figure you need to get to for that budget. So in part 2, I want you to give me a justification of the cuts that you made. Why did you make this cut? Why was this budget cut determined to be more reasonable and more practical than other alternatives that you could have pursued? The budget you're putting together in part 1 is a line item budget. And part of the exercise is to get you to focus on some of the limitations of a simple line item budget format. So also in part 2, you'll give me a narrative discussing line item budgeting, analyze the line item budget, and tell me what some of its weaknesses are. And then finally in part 2, I want you to give me an analysis of other possible revenue sources that could be used to mitigate some of the budget cuts that you made in part 1. Because again, in part 1, you're going to have to cut a substantial amount of money from the budget. And you're going to be going from like a $3.2 million budget to a $2.9 million budget. Well, in making those $300,000 or so worth of budget cuts, Is there a way that could have been avoided by enhancing your revenue? Are there some other revenue sources that you could look for in order to try and reduce the size and scope of some of those budget cuts? But we'll go over that critical assignment again at the end of this video, just to give you a few more particulars and a few more details on what the actual assignment looks like. Here in week one, though, for assignments that are due by Saturday, you have your multimedia discussion board assignment. And again, you've done multimedia discussion boards in other classes in the program. This is an introductory one. And so for this one, I want you to tell me about yourself, your family, maybe pets, where do you work, and what are your hobbies, what do you like to do? And I also like for you to think about from your childhood, the first thing you remember saving money up to buy, which is really your first experience with budgeting. So give me an example from your childhood of when you saved up money to buy something, when you actually engaged in kind of an informal budgeting process to begin with. And then importantly this week, another task that you're going to have is to locate a budget from a city government. And then that budget is something you will be using throughout the rest of the class as your example. So you can get this budget online. Almost every single city has their budget online. You pick the city, go to their website, download their budget, take a quick look at the budget, become familiar with the budget, because we are going to be using that budget throughout the remaining weeks of the course. Now, the city you select is completely up to you. I have no preference. But as you're looking at a city budget, if you're not sure whether or not that city budget will work well for the course, feel free to send me an email and give me a link to that budget and say, this is the budget I found. Can you take a look at it and tell me whether or not it will work for the class? Chances are 99% of the budgets that you find will work for the course. My piece of advice to you, though, as you look for this city budget, look for a budget that has a good budget summary. All budgets will have a budget summary. Some are better than others. But if they have maybe a 15 or 20 or 25-page budget summary that outlines for you the major sources of revenue, the major objects of expenditure, major challenges, fiscal challenges that are facing the city. If you have a good summary that lists that information for you, it will make your life in the class much easier. And so feel free to send me that link. I'll take a look at it and let you know whether or not I think the budget will work well for the assignments in the class. Journal 1, you'll also be doing for this week. And this journal entry is really a 3-part entry. And for your journals, as you know, don't attach documents. I want you typing directly into the journal area, so don't just attach a file. But there's a 3-part aspect to this journal for this week. In section 1, we're going to focus on classical theories. So in 1918, Willoughby wrote that no single change would add so largely to both democracy and efficiency as the introduction of proper budget methods. Using details from that Willoughby article, along with some information from Woodrow Wilson's classic article from 1887, and perhaps even some information from Article 1 and Article 2 of the Constitution, develop a paragraph on how the federal budget process in the early 1900s began to further define the roles between legislative and executive branches of government. Use information from inside both articles to develop this paragraph for section 1 of your journal entry. Now, as you know, in the Constitution, Article 1 is devoted entirely to Congress. Article 2 is devoted entirely to the executive branch and the president. So here we're trying to get a sense for how the federal budget process developed in a way in which it helped to crystallize the roles of Congress and the president in the budgetary process. Then in section 2, you can provide me with a paragraph on the role of budgets, allocation of funds with regards to concepts such as market failures, public goods, free riders, and externalities. Some of the information we've already covered in this video. Paragraph should demonstrate you have a firm understanding of each concept and are able to tie the ideas back to the budgetary process of fund allocation. Basically, that's just a wordy way of saying, demonstrate to me in this paragraph that you have a working familiarity with market failures, public goods, free riders, and externalities, and how those concepts affect the resulting public budget, how they affect the size and the scope of the things we're spending money on in that public budget. But again, that's just a simple paragraph to show me your working knowledge of those major public finance concepts, which are really elementary to everything else we're going to build upon throughout the remainder of the class. And then section 3, give me another paragraph in which you tell me about your experience with budgeting. So do you have experience working with federal, state, or local budgets? Do you have experience working with private sector budgets? Or is your only experience working with your own household budget? No right or wrong answer here. This is just an assessment mechanism. So I have an idea of the amount of experience and familiarity you have with budgeting upon entering this course. So for your journal, you got those 3 sections, if you will, for that journal entry. Again, type it directly into the journal area rather than attaching a file. So your deliverables, if you will, for this week, you have your multimedia discussion board introduction of yourself, and you then have this 3-part journal entry. So those are the things that you'll be delivering at the end of this first week of the class. Again, some of the topics we've covered in this video, such as market failures and free riders and all that good stuff, it's covered extensively in the reading in the Mike-Cell textbook, and so I do recommend that you do read Mike-Cell, combine it with the information from this video, and it should give you all the information you need to get started in the class and to get your 2 deliverables taken care of for this first week. But I also said then this week I give you a sneak preview of the critical assignment that we'll be doing week 8. So let's take a few seconds and go through some of the elements of that critical assignment to make sure that you understand it and you're familiar with it in week 1 so that you can then prepare for it and you won't have to wait until the last second to put it together in week 8. So let's take a look at some elements of that critical assignment. Okay, let's take a look at your critical assignment. Again, just for the purpose of previewing it, so you may feel a little bit better about it, and you'll know what you're expected to do then when it comes due in week 8. The purpose of the critical assignment is, again, to give you 2 different mini assignments, I guess, within the one critical assignment. The first part is the creation of a budget, a consolidated budget, based upon the scenario that I provided for you here on the screen. You'll see let me move this for a second. The critical assignment consists of 2 parts. In the first part of the assignment, students will utilize a library budget consolidation case study. And I'm going to give you all the details of that in a second. And you're going to use that case study produced by Mark Huddleston many years ago to put together an Excel spreadsheet for a consolidated budget. The case that you're going to be working from is the following. It's a scenario in which the County Board of Supervisors recently voted to consolidate several branch libraries into one consolidated library system. The current library system consists of 11 separate library branches, each branch with its own budget. And when you look at the spreadsheet I provided for you, you'll see each library branch is listed for you. And so there's a City of Waynesfield branch. There's I think there's a City of Littleton branch, and so on and so on. There are 11 different branch libraries, each with its own budget. You are the Deputy Budget Director, and you have been charged with taking these 11 branch library budgets and consolidating them together into one county-wide library budget. In consolidating the budget, you must adhere to the following requirements. Now, these are very important because these are the parameters that you need to adhere to in creating your consolidated budget. Number 1, all existing branch libraries must remain open. No branches may be closed. So you're making your budget cuts. You'll see in a second why you're making budget cuts. You are not able to close any of your branch libraries. Everything stays open. Number 2, the county's agreement with municipalities requires that the new consolidated budget must be 3% less than the aggregate of the existing branch budgets. So the first thing you're going to do with the spreadsheet that's provided for you is you're going to add up all the spending that's currently going on across those 11 branch libraries. When you add all that up, it's going to be northward of $3 million. That is your pre-consolidated budget total. First thing you're going to do is add all those up. Then, when you create your final consolidated budget, the amount of money you are spending must be at least 3% less than what you've just calculated, 3% less than the aggregate of all the branch libraries pre-consolidation. So you're going to have to do a 3% countywide budget cut. In doing that 3% countywide budget cut, you are not allowed to make any cuts to full-time employees. You can cut part-time employees, you can lay them off, you can cut their hours, but you may not make any cuts to full-time employees. Number 4, and this is the really tough one. The county's agreement with public employee unions requires that the salary scales within job classifications are to be standardized at the highest levels currently paid by any of the newly consolidated units. This means that all employees in a position classification must be paid the highest salary currently paid by any branch for that position classification. In other words, if you have a reference librarian position classification, when you look at your budget, you will realize that different branches pay different salaries for that same reference librarian position. According to this agreement, you are going to have to standardize the salary for reference librarians so that there's only one salary for every reference librarian across the entire county library system. And that salary must be the highest salary currently paid by any of the branches. So what this amounts to is the requirement to give a lot of people raises, because you'll see when you look at the spreadsheet, the city of Waynesfield is the largest branch. And as the largest branch, in all cases except for one, it pays the highest salary for all position classifications. So what you're going to be doing is raising everyone's salary essentially to the city of Waynesfield level. So you're going to be giving a lot of people raises, while at the same time you are required to cut 3% from your overall spending. So that's what makes this a little bit more complicated of an exercise. You got to cut 3%, but you're also going to be increasing your spending by giving people raises. So the original size of the cut, that $300,000 or so cut, really is larger than that. Because once you standardize all your salaries, you're probably adding on an additional $200,000. So your overall cut is probably going to be closer to about $500,000 or so. So it makes your task a little bit more difficult. Next criteria, all branch librarians designated head librarians, either full or part-time, will be redesignated as branch librarians and compensated accordingly. This is true for all head librarians with the exception of the head librarian for the city of Waynesfield. That head librarian, as you'll see in the next point, will become the director of county libraries, which is a brand new position, and will be budgeted at $45,000 per year. So in your final consolidated budget, you should no longer have a classification called head librarian. Head librarian classification is going away. The head librarian in Waynesfield will be reclassified a director of county libraries, creation of a new position. All the other head librarians at the branch libraries will become branch librarians and will then be compensated at the branch librarian salary level. So you should not have any head librarian designation in your final consolidated budget. So your job in part 1, or the assignment, is to use the spreadsheet I provided for you. And I've given you that spreadsheet. It's linked here in week 1. Use that spreadsheet because I have all the formulas in there, so you don't have to go in there and put new formulas or do any of that. I know some of you may have very advanced Excel skills. Some of you may not have worked with Excel much at all. So I've tried to create a level, even playing field by putting all the formulas in the spreadsheet. So the nice thing is, since all the formulas are in there, if you go into the spreadsheet, you change the salary, hit enter, then it'll automatically change. So if you're paying someone $32,000 and you have 2 employees, you're going to raise that salary to $34,000. Then the $64,000 that you're currently spending, once you hit enter, will then change automatically to $68,000. So all the formulas are in there. You can just change your salaries, change your number of positions. You make all those changes, and then the numbers will automatically repopulate. So do use that spreadsheet. Don't start from scratch. and create a consolidated spreadsheet for the entire county library system that adheres to these 6 criteria that I've listed for you here in week number 1. So that's part 1 of your critical assignment, putting together that consolidated spreadsheet for the county library system based upon the criteria I've provided for you in this case. Once you have completed your spreadsheet for part 1, you'll then need to complete part 2 of the assignment. Part 2 consists of a 5 to 7 page narrative analysis of the changes that you made to arrive at your consolidated budget. In this section of the assignment, you'll prepare a report to the budget director in which you will do the following. So in these 5 to 7 page narrative, you will do this. Number 1, you will discuss and defend the budget reductions that you made to reduce overall spending by 3%. So you'll say, perhaps I reduced 3 part-time reference librarian positions, and it saved this amount of money. The reason why I did this is, and give me a defense for why you did that. One of the most effective strategies you can use to defend your reductions is to illustrate why the reductions that you chose are more practical and reasonable than other possible alternatives. It's always a good strategy to say, well, this is the best course of action because it is better than these other alternatives. So if you reduce 3 part-time reference librarian positions, why is that superior to doing something else? So compare it to an alternative strategy that you did not select. In doing so, be realistic about some of the consequences and externalities of your recommended cuts and why these consequences are less severe than other alternatives. So what are some of the consequences of cutting those 3 reference librarian positions? So you're defending all the cuts that you made in your spreadsheet in part 1. Then also in part 2, I want you to explain to me line item budgeting and some of the limitations and weaknesses of line item budgeting in comparison to other budget formats. So when I say in comparison to other budget formats, I'm talking primarily about performance, program, and zero-based budgeting. So what are some of the problems of line item budgeting compared to performance, program, and zero-based budgeting? And then finally, recommend for me some additional alternative revenue sources that the library system may consider to alleviate some of the cuts that you propose in your budget in part 1. Why are these recommended revenue sources superior to other alternatives? So again, just to recap, in part 2, you're going to be writing a 5 to 7 page narrative. And I don't get too hung up on page length or anything like that. I'm more focused on the quality of what you're producing as opposed to the quantity. But people always ask, well, how long should it be? Well, general rule of thumb, 5 to 7 pages. So part 2 will be a 5 to 7 page narrative where you defend your budget cuts to me, where you talk to me about line item budgeting and its weaknesses compared to other budget formats. And then where you, number 3, recommend to me other revenue sources that could help alleviate or mitigate some of the cuts that you propose in the spreadsheet that you developed for part 1 of the critical assignment. So just to recap, for the critical assignment, you'll be turning in 2 documents. First document will just be your spreadsheet with your consolidated budget, and then the second document will be this 5 to 7 page narrative. You'll upload both of those documents as one submission into the critical assignment section in week 8 of the course. And the way in which you've designed the course is week 8 will basically be your critical assignment. And so we don't have other assignments going on and other things going on, new material or anything like that in week 8. Week 8 will be the completion then of your critical assignment, this 2-part critical assignment. So read through this information again, download, I've got those 2 files attached. The one, the line item budget Excel spreadsheet, is the template that you'll be working off of in order to create your spreadsheet for part 1 of the critical assignment and just work right in that spreadsheet. The other one, that's the PDF file entitled Huddleston. That's just a recap of the case study that I've just listed for you here in the sneak preview. It's just a recap of that. Don't worry about any of the other assignments that he has going on in that PDF. Don't worry about that. You don't have to answer any of those questions, do any of those things. Just focus on in Form 56 on that PDF file. You will see these 6 criteria. The same 6 criteria I've listed for you here will be in that PDF file. Also in that PDF file, he breaks down each of the library budgets separately that are in the Excel spreadsheet. Just use the library, the numbers in the Excel spreadsheet, and work off the numbers in the Excel spreadsheet. I think working off that spreadsheet, using it as your template, will make part 1 of the assignment much, much easier to do. So that's your critical assignment. Read through all that, download the files, take a look at those. If you have any questions at all on the critical assignment, please feel free to email me. It's better to answer any questions earlier as opposed to later. And so if we can get all the questions and all the clarifications done for the critical assignment before we get to week 8, I think that would be ideal. It's always better to ask and answer questions early as opposed to later in the semester. So I think that's about it for your overview for week 1. I hope you have a great week. Again, any questions at all, feel free to email me, and I'll be happy to answer them. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a great week and a great introduction to the wonderful world of public budgeting and public finance.